I want you to understand something about luxury malls on a Saturday afternoon. They are designed, architecturally and psychologically, to make you feel safe. The lighting is warm and deliberate. The marble floors gleam. The storefronts glow like promises. The ambient sound is a carefully engineered blend of soft music and the pleasant percussion of commerce. Heels on stone, shopping bags rustling, children laughing near the fountain. Everything about the environment communicates the same message. Nothing bad happens here. This is a place for beautiful things. I had given myself exactly 3 hours. 3 hours of something I hadn't allowed myself in 4 years of marriage and 8 months of its brutal aftermath. The uncomplicated freedom of being alone in a public place without calculating the exits. Without checking my phone every 4 minutes. Without that particular tightness across my shoulders that had become so constant I'd stopped recognizing it as fear and started accepting it as posture. If this story gave you chills, just wait for what's coming next. Stories like this aren't just about power. They're about the moment someone decides to stand up. If you felt that moment, hit subscribe and stay with us. And tell me something. Where are you watching from right now? I read the comments. And the next story might be for your city. Now let's dive in. My name is Isabel Warner. I am 31 years old. I am a graphic designer, a decent cook, a woman who laughs too loudly at her own jokes and cries at insurance commercials. I am also a woman who spent the better part of 4 years learning to make herself very, very small in the presence of a man who needed to feel very, very large. Henry Grantham. My ex-husband. The restraining order in my bag, folded into the interior zipper pocket, had his name on it in clean legal typeface. 500 feet. That was the law's best approximation of how much space I needed between his body and mine to constitute safety. 500 feet is nothing. I want you to understand that too. I was standing at the window of a stationery shop on the 2nd floor, looking at a set of drawing pencils, thinking about whether I could justify the expense, feeling the particular quiet pleasure of a thought that belonged only to me, when I heard him. Not his voice first. His footsteps. I had spent 4 years memorizing the specific weight distribution of Henry Grantham in a bad mood, and my nervous system recognized it before my conscious mind did. My shoulders went tight. My stomach dropped through the floor. I turned. He was already close. Too close. The crowd parted around him the way crowds part for men who move like they own the space, and his eyes were already locked on mine with the expression I knew better than any other face he wore. The one that said, "I have decided something and you are not going to like it." Isabel. Not a greeting. A claim. I want to tell you I ran. I want to tell you I screamed, or produced the restraining order, or did any of the logical things that seem so obvious from a distance. What I actually did was freeze, the way prey freezes, the way every cell in a body trained by years of consequence goes absolutely catastrophically still. His hand found my hair before I finished the thought. The marble floor came up fast. The sound that followed was mine, involuntary, animal, nothing like the dignified composure I had promised myself I would maintain if this ever happened again. People around us scattered and stopped and stared and did what people in shopping malls do when violence interrupts commerce. They watched. They filmed. They did not move. And then from somewhere to my left, in the direction of the Atrium Cafe, came a sound that cut through everything else. Not a shout. Not movement. Not the scrape of a chair or the clatter of intervention. The soft, deliberate clink of gold against marble. I turned my head against the pane and saw him through the blur of tears and shock. A man seated at a cafe table with a glass of whiskey catching the warm light, unhurried, watching the scene with the particular stillness of someone who has already decided what is going to happen, and is simply waiting for the appropriate moment to make it so. He was removing his rings, one at a time, methodically, setting each one on the table with the care of a man preparing for work. He does not want to damage his jewelry doing. He wasn't rushing. That was the part that reached through my fear and grabbed something deeper. He was not rushing at all. He looked up and met my eyes across the chaos of the atrium floor, and his expression was not outrage, not urgency, not even particular anger. It was something far colder and far more final than any of those things. It was recognition. The look of a man who has seen this specific species of cowardice before, and has very specific feelings about what should be done with it. He set down the last ring. He stood. The crowd somehow seemed to understand what was about to happen before it did. The filming stopped. The murmuring stopped. The mall itself seemed to hold its breath. Henry Grantham, for the first time in the 4 years I had known him, stopped moving. He had just realized that the thing looking at him across the marble floor was not a bystander. It was a reckoning. And it had been sitting 20 feet away the entire time, waiting patiently for him to give it a reason. He had his hand in my hair before I could form a complete thought. That is the thing about violence from someone who has practiced it on you specifically. It doesn't announce itself. There is no transition between the world being normal and the world being this. One moment I was looking at drawing pencils through a shop window, thinking about whether the cold press set was worth the extra $12, and the next moment the floor was rushing toward my face and the only sound I could make was the kind that comes from somewhere below language. The marble was cold. That detail stayed with me afterward with the specificity that trauma assigns to irrelevant things. Not the pain, which was enormous, but the cold. The floor of the Meridian Mall's second-level atrium was polished black marble, and it was cold against my palms and my cheek and the bare skin of my forearm where my sleeve had ridden up, and I remember thinking with the fractured logic of shock that I had read somewhere that marble retains temperature, that it stays cold in summer and warm in winter, that it is, geologically, a metamorphic rock, something that became what it is through extreme pressure and heat. I remember thinking that, while Henry dragged me across it by my hair. For months, he was saying above me. His voice had the quality it got when the drinking had reached a specific level. Not slurred, never slurred, but loosened. The governor removed. For months of your lawyers and your paperwork and your little piece of paper telling me where I can and cannot go. I clawed at his hand. I had read somewhere that you should go toward the pain in these situations, move into the grip rather than away from it, reduce the tension on the roots. I knew this. I could not make my body do it. My body was doing something much older and much less tactical than anything I had read. The crowd around us had formed the particular shape crowds form around violence. A rough circle, close enough to witness, far enough to maintain deniability. Phones up. Faces horrified and fascinated in equal measure. Somewhere a child was crying. Somewhere a security guard was talking into a radio. Nobody moved. And then Henry stopped moving. Not because of the security guard. Not because of the crowd. Because of the shadow that fell across both of us, large, unhurried, belonging to a man who had crossed the atrium at a pace that suggested he had nowhere urgent to be, which was somehow more frightening than if he had run. Henry looked up. I felt the exact moment he understood what he was looking at, because his grip in my hair loosened by a fraction, not release, but the involuntary slackening of a hand whose owner has just experienced something reorienting. Richard Benson looked down at Henry Grantham with the expression of a man performing a very simple calculation. His hands, I noticed, were bare. No rings. What followed was not a fight. A fight implies two participants of comparable intent. What followed was a correction, brief, devastating, and entirely without anger. The absence of anger was the worst part. Henry made sounds. Richard made none. When it was finished, Henry was on the marble, and Richard was crouching beside me, and his voice when it came was quiet enough that only I could hear it. Can you stand? Not are you okay? Not I've got you. Just the immediate practical question of a man already 3 steps ahead of the current moment. I looked at him. Dark eyes, completely steady. The glass of whiskey still on the table behind him, catching the atrium light like something from another world entirely. Yes, I said. My voice came out smaller than I intended. He offered his hand. Not urgently. The way you offer a hand to someone you are giving the choice to. I took it. I came back to consciousness the way you surface from deep water, slowly aware of pressure before I was aware of anything else. The ceiling above me was not mine. That was the first coherent thought. My ceiling at home had a hairline crack running from the light fixture toward the window that I had been meaning to report to my landlord for 3 months. This ceiling was smooth, white, and recessed with the kind of soft lighting that costs more than my monthly rent to install. The pillow beneath my head was the variety of expensive that announces itself through pure, unreasonable softness. I was wearing something clean. My clothes from the mall were gone. I sat up too quickly and the room moved sideways. I gripped the edge of the bed, an actual bed, not a hospital gurney, and waited for the geometry to stabilize. Slowly, a woman's voice, measured, accented, professional. A nurse appeared at the periphery of my vision, small and efficient, adjusting something on a stand I recognized as an 4-line running into my left arm. You have a mild concussion and significant soft tissue trauma. You've been asleep for 6 hours. Where am I? Somewhere safe. Which was not an answer. The room resolved itself gradually. Private, clearly. No shared ward, no institutional smell, no sounds of other patients or overworked staff. The furniture was dark wood. There were actual curtains on the window. A chair in the corner held a folded blanket and on the small table beside it, a glass of water and a phone that was not mine. The phone is for you, the nurse said. When you're ready. I was not ready for some time. I drank the water. I catalogued my injuries with the systematic thoroughness of a woman who had, in a previous chapter of her life, become unfortunately expert at this particular inventory. My scalp ached with a bone-deep persistence. My palms were abraded. My right shoulder had been wrenched in a direction shoulders are not designed to travel. Everything else was the ordinary wreckage of a marble floor and 4 years of stored tension, finally arriving at a single point. I picked up the phone. There was one contact saved. No name. Just a number. I didn't call it. I sat with it in my hand until the door to the room opened and the answer to every question I had walked in instead. He was taller than he had seemed in the chaos of the atrium. Or perhaps the chaos had simply compressed everything. The scale of events, the scale of people, the scale of what had just happened to my ordinary Saturday afternoon. In the quiet of the private room, he occupied space with the particular confidence of someone who has never needed to announce himself in any room he has entered. He was carrying 2 cups of coffee. That detail disarmed me more than anything else could have. You're awake, he said. Not surprised. He had the quality I would come to learn, of a man who was rarely surprised by anything. Where am I? I asked again. A private medical facility. He set one of the cups on the table near my bed. Didn't hand it to me. Set it within reach and left the choice to me. You needed stitches on your scalp and monitoring for the concussion. The hospital would have required a police report. I assumed you'd want to make that decision yourself. I looked at him. Who are you? Something moved across his expression. Not quite a smile, not quite its opposite. Richard Benson, he said. The name arrived in my chest like a stone dropped into still water. I knew it. Everyone in the city knew it, in the way you know the names of weather systems and fault lines, not from direct experience, but from the specific quality of the silence that falls when someone says it in the wrong company. I looked at the coffee cup he had placed within my reach. Then back at him. You removed your rings, I said. Before. I did. Why? He considered the question with genuine seriousness, as though it deserved it. I didn't want to damage them, he said. The room was very quiet. Outside the curtained window, the city continued its indifferent business. Somewhere in it, Henry Grantham was either in custody or he wasn't, and the restraining order in my ruined bag was still just a piece of paper. I reached for the coffee. The estate was 40 minutes outside the city, which I understood immediately was the point. Richard's car, black, silent, driven by a man whose name I was not offered and did not ask for, moved through the kind of neighborhood where the houses disappear behind walls and gates and mature trees planted specifically to ensure that whatever happens inside stays inside. I watched the city recede through the tinted window and told myself the tightness in my chest was gratitude. That the correct response to being driven away from my apartment, my routines, and every ordinary mechanism of my independence was appreciation. I was not entirely convincing. The estate itself was beautiful in the way that serious money is always beautiful. Not showy, not excessive, but complete. The grounds were immaculate. The main house was stone and glass, 3 floors, set back from the gate by a long drive lined with something I would have identified as topiary if I'd had more confidence in my botanical knowledge. Inside, it smelled like old wood and fresh flowers and the particular neutral quality of air that has been climate-controlled to within a precise degree. A woman named Clara showed me to a guest suite on the 2nd floor. The room was larger than my apartment. The bathroom had heated floors. "Mr. Benson asks that you make yourself at home," Clara said, and delivered the line with the practiced warmth of someone who had said it many times before, which told me something about the estate's relationship with guests who arrived under unusual circumstances. I thanked her. I closed the door. I stood in the center of the room and performed the slow, methodical breathing exercise my therapist had taught me 2 years ago that I had since deployed in approximately 100 situations she had not anticipated. By the 2nd day, I had walked every accessible corridor of the main house. By the 3rd, I had identified which windows faced the gate and at what angle. By the 4th, I had asked Clara politely whether there was a schedule for the car, whether it might be possible to return to my apartment for some things, my work files specifically, my drafting tablet which I needed for the freelance contracts that were not pausing simply because my life had temporarily destabilized. Clara had smiled and said she would ask Mr. Benson. Mr. Benson, it emerged, was not immediately available. I found him that evening in the library on the ground floor, a room I had not previously located, because the door, when closed, was indistinguishable from the wall paneling. He was at a desk, reading something that he didn't close when I entered, which I took as either trust or the confidence of a man accustomed to people entering rooms on his terms. "The car," I said. "I need to go back to my apartment." He looked up. "Your apartment is being watched." "By whom?" "Henry's associates." He said it without drama, a fact presented for my consideration. 2 men. Rotating shifts. They began the morning after the mall. I stood with this for a moment. "So I'm a prisoner here," I said. "You're a guest," he said, "with a temporary geographic limitation." "That's a precise way of describing a cage, Mr. Benson." Something shifted in his expression. Not offense, not defensiveness. Something closer to recognition. He closed the document on his desk and gave me his full attention, which was, I was learning, not a small thing. "What do you need from your apartment?" he said. I told him. He wrote nothing down. He looked at me with the focused attention of a man who does not need to write things down and said it would be arranged by morning. It was. Every item. Packed carefully, transported. Placed in the guest suite exactly as I had described. I stood looking at my drafting tablet on the beautiful unfamiliar desk and understood that the cage, however golden, had just become more comfortable, and that comfort and freedom, I had learned the hard way, were not the same thing. But I also understood something else, something I was not ready to examine directly yet. I had slept for 4 consecutive nights without checking the locks. They left it on the gate. Not slipped through the bars, not thrown over attached. Deliberately, methodically, with the kind of cable tie that requires a tool to apply cleanly, which meant someone had stood at the perimeter of Richard Benson's estate, in full view of whatever security infrastructure existed there, and taken their time. That was the message before I even read what was written on it. Clara brought it to me at breakfast without explanation, set it on the table beside my coffee, and left the room. It was a photograph printed on plain paper, laminated against the weather. The photograph was of me, taken by the angle and framing, from somewhere above and to the left of the stationery shop window where I had been standing before Henry's hand found my hair. Before any of this. Which meant it had been taken before the assault. Which meant Henry had been watching me before he approached. Which meant the mall had not been coincidence or rage, or alcohol loosening his governor. It had been planned. On the back, in Henry's handwriting, I would have known it at any distance, the particular aggressive forward lean of it, the letters that pressed so hard they embossed the reverse side, were 7 words. "No one keeps what belongs to me." I set it down on the table. I picked up my coffee. I performed the breathing exercise. I looked out the window at the immaculate grounds and the gate at the end of the drive and the space beyond it that was, apparently, less of a barrier than it appeared. Richard came into the breakfast room 20 minutes later. He looked at the photograph on the table without picking it up, then at me. "You've seen it," he said. "Clara brought it with the toast," I said. "Very efficient morning." He sat down across from me. This was new. He had not previously joined me at meals, had maintained a precise and courteous distance that I had understood as respect and now wondered if it had also been strategy, allowing me to settle before introducing complications. "The gate camera shows 2 men," he said. 3:47 a.m. In and out in under 90 seconds. "Henry's not one of them." "No. Henry doesn't do his own errands." He said it without contempt, a simple taxonomic observation. He has a relationship with 3 individuals currently under separate federal investigations. They operate as a unit when the fee is right. I looked at the laminated photograph, at my own face unaware, tilted toward a window display with the particular expression of someone experiencing, briefly, the uncomplicated pleasure of being alone. "He had someone watching me," I said. "Before the mall." "Yes. The mall wasn't impulsive." "No. I absorbed this." Outside, one of the ground staff was moving across the lawn with the unhurried pace of someone whose morning contained no laminated photographs. I watched him for a moment. "The restraining order," I said. "Is a piece of paper," Richard said. "Not unkindly. Simply accurately." "I know. I had known for 8 months. I had known the day the judge signed it and slid it across the desk with the expression of someone who understood exactly how much and how little it meant in practice. "What does your piece of paper look like, Mr. Benson?" He was quiet for a moment. His hands were flat on the table, bare of rings in the way they always were inside the estate. I had noticed he only wore them outside. Armor, I had decided. Or signal. "Less decorative," he said. "More permanent." I turned the photograph face down on the table so I didn't have to look at my own unaware face anymore. "Then I think," I said carefully, "it may be time to discuss what comes next." It started with my hands. Richard looked at them the morning after our breakfast conversation, looked at them the way he looked at most things, which was to say with the systematic attention of someone extracting information rather than simply observing, and said, "You've never been taught how to use them." "I'm a graphic designer," I said. "I use them constantly." "Not for this." This turned out to be a room I hadn't located in my corridor mapping of the estate. Below the main house, access through a door in the mudroom that I had assumed was a utility cupboard, was a space that had been converted with the same quiet thoroughness that characterized everything Richard did. Mats on the floor. A heavy bag in the corner. Mirrors on 2 walls. No windows. The particular neutral smell of a room that takes effort seriously. I stood in the middle of it in borrowed clothes. Clara had produced training gear from somewhere without being asked, and felt simultaneously ridiculous and, underneath that, something that was not quite readiness but was adjacent to it. Richard removed his jacket, folded it, set it on a bench with his rings beside it. "The goal," he said, moving to the center of the mat, "is not to win a fight." "What's the goal?" "To survive long enough for the situation to change." He said it with the directness of someone who had thought carefully about the difference. Winning requires matching force. Surviving requires creating an opportunity. Those are not the same objective. He spent the first hour on stance. Nothing else, just the geometry of how I stood, where my weight sat, the specific positioning of my feet that he adjusted 3 times, crouching to the floor to physically reposition my heel by approximately 1 inch and then standing to assess the result with the expression of someone checking calibration on a precise instrument. It was objectively not romantic. It was technical and repetitive, and my hip flexors registered a protest by the 40-minute mark. And yet, there is a particular quality of intimacy in being taught something physical by someone who takes your capability seriously. Not your current capability, your potential capability. Richard did not adjust for my lack of experience by simplifying his expectations. He adjusted his instruction. The distinction mattered more than I knew how to articulate. Again, he said, for the 11th time, after I had attempted the same deflection movement 11 times with results ranging from adequate to genuinely poor. I'm doing it wrong, I said. You're doing it early. The timing is different from what your instinct suggests. He moved beside me, positioned his arm to demonstrate the precise angle of interception. Your instinct right now is to react to the motion. I need you to react to the intention before the motion completes. I looked at him. How do you learn to read intention? He met my eyes. Something in the quality of his attention shifted, not less focused but focused on something different than my stance. You stop assuming people mean you no harm, he said quietly. And then you learn to tell the difference between the ones who don't and the ones who do. The room was very still around us. That sounds like a hard way to live, I said. It is, he said. Until it isn't. We stood close enough that I could see the specific quality of old damage in his expression. Not fresh, not raw, but permanent. The kind that has been integrated rather than healed. I recognized it the way you recognize a language you learned before you knew you were learning it. Again, he said. But his voice had changed by a register. I set my feet. I found the stance. I waited for his arm to move. This time I was early enough. I found it by accident. That seems to be how the important things arrive. It was a Tuesday evening, 11 days into my residence at the estate, and I had taken to working late in the ground floor study that Richard had made available to me. A smaller room adjacent to the library with a north-facing window that gave good natural light in the afternoons. I had my drafting tablet, my freelance files, and 3 overdue projects that had waited patiently through the upheaval of my life, and were now waiting considerably less patiently. I needed a reference book. Something architectural. I was designing a logo for a firm that wanted classical column motifs, and my knowledge of Corinthian versus Ionic had reached its limit. The library next door had, as far as I had observed, a copy of everything ever written about everything, so I went looking. The book I needed was on the 3rd shelf from the top of the east wall. I found a step stool. I found the book. And I also found, because the shelf was narrower than it appeared and I misjudged the reach, that I knocked something from the space behind the architectural references, a place where books had been arranged in front of other objects, which is where people put things they want close but not visible. What fell was a photograph in a plain frame. Small. The glass cracked when it hit the floor but didn't shatter. Picked it up. A young woman, perhaps 19 or 20, standing in front of a building I didn't recognize. Dark hair, dark eyes. A laugh caught mid-expression that gave her face the quality of someone who laughed frequently and genuinely. She was wearing a yellow jacket. Behind her, half out of frame, a much younger version of Richard Benson stood with his hand on her shoulder, and the expression of someone who does not yet know what he is about to lose. I was still holding it when Richard appeared in the library doorway. We looked at each other across the room. I looked at the photograph. He looked at it too, with an expression I had not seen on him before. Not guarded, not controlled. Something that had no management left in it. I'm sorry, I said. It fell. I should have. Her name was Claire, he said. He crossed the room and sat in one of the reading chairs without being invited, which told me something about the weight of whatever was about to be said. Richard Benson did not sit uninvited. He did not speak without architecture around his words. Tonight there was no architecture. Claire was his younger sister. She had married at 22, a man Richard had not trusted on instinct but could not quantify in accusation. When she began showing the particular signs that, Richard told me, he now understood with devastating clarity and then had simply not recognized, he had told her that marriages required work. That she should be patient. That leaving would embarrass the family at a time when the family could not afford embarrassment. Richard had been building then, acquiring, negotiating the foundations of everything the estate represented, and the timing had seemed genuinely terrible to him. He had been 26. He had been wrong in the specific catastrophic way that people who trust their own judgment absolutely are capable of being wrong. Claire had died 14 months after the conversation where Richard told her to stay. He said this last part looking at the window rather than at me. His voice remained even throughout. That was almost the worst part, the evenness. The voice of a man who has said something so many times in his own head, that the saying of it aloud has become simply another repetition of the same permanent damage. The room was very quiet. "You think if you protect me," I said slowly, "it changes what happened to her." "I know it doesn't," he said. "That's not the same as it being untrue." I looked at the photograph in my hands. The young woman in the yellow jacket with the mid-laugh expression and no knowledge of what was coming. "How long have you been carrying this?" I asked. He looked at me then. Something in his expression shifted. Not release, not relief, but the particular quality of a weight that has been acknowledged by another person for the first time and is therefore, fractionally, less entirely alone. 11 years, he said. 3 months. And some days. I set the photograph on the table between us face up so Claire was visible to both of us. I did not tell him it wasn't his fault. He had heard that, I suspected, and it had not helped, and I was not in the business of offering comfort that didn't fit the actual shape of a wound. Instead, I sat in the other chair and stayed there, present and quiet, while the estate settled around us and the city beyond the window went about its indifferent evening. It was, I understood, the most useful thing I could offer. And it was, from the way his shoulders changed very slightly, almost imperceptibly, enough. The message came through Clara at 11:47 p.m. Not a photograph this time. A location, the Meridian Harbor Facility, Pier 7, sent to my personal phone number that Henry should not have had. Which meant the federal investigation into his associates had not moved quickly enough, and someone in that chain had sold something they shouldn't have. And the gap between Richard's world and the official machinery of consequence had just become relevant in a way I could no longer observe from the safety of a second-floor guest suite. I should have woken Richard immediately. I want to be precise about that. I know I should have, and I chose not to, and the reason was not courage or strategy. It was something older and less rational. 4 years of being the problem that other people had to manage had left a residue in me that even 11 days of heated floors and training sessions had not entirely dissolved. I did not want to be rescued again. I wanted for once to not require it. I took the car keys from the mudroom hook. I took my phone. I took the muscle memory of 23 training sessions and the specific lesson about reacting to intention rather than motion, and I drove to the harbor. Pier 7 was the kind of industrial waterfront that cities accumulate and then forget, active enough to avoid demolition, neglected enough to avoid attention. Shipping containers in irregular stacks. Dock lighting that illuminated in pools with significant dark between them. The smell of brine and diesel and cold metal. My footsteps on the walkway announced me before I could prevent it. Henry was waiting by the water's edge. He looked worse than the mall. Not physically, but in the quality of his expression. The mall had been anger wearing the costume of control. This was something that had stopped bothering with the costume. "There she is," he said. "No bodyguard tonight." "No," I said. I stopped 12 feet from him. I set my feet the way Richard had adjusted them 11 times on the first morning. Weight-centered. Hands where I could use them. Henry moved toward me the way he always had, with the assumption of a foregone conclusion. He had spent 4 years teaching me to accept foregone conclusions. He had not been in the room for the 23 sessions in the basement. When he reached for my arm, I wasn't there. The deflection was not perfect. It was early, not early in the way Richard had taught me reacting to intention, but early in the way of adrenaline and imprecision. But it was enough to redirect his momentum, and momentum, Richard had told me, is simply force with a direction. Change the direction. Henry stumbled. He turned, recalibrating, and in his expression for the first time I saw something I had never seen directed at me from his face. Uncertainty. I didn't speak. I had nothing to say to him that the last 4 years hadn't already covered. Behind Henry, in the dark between the dock lighting, figures materialized from the shadows with the coordinated quiet of people who had been there considerably longer than either of us. Not police. Something more efficient than police. They moved with the particular purposefulness of men who had been given clear instructions and had no interest in improvisation. Richard walked out of the dark last. He was in his full rings. All of them. Which I understood now as the opposite of what I'd first assumed. Not preparation for violence, but its conclusion. He had already done what needed doing on the perimeter. Henry's associates, the men who rotated shifts at the estate gate, were no longer a variable. He stopped beside me and looked at Henry with the expression I recognized from the atrium, the simple calculation of a man who has already completed the arithmetic and is now observing the remainder. "Isabel," he said, without looking away from Henry, "are you hurt?" "No," I said. "You drove yourself here." "Yes." A pause. "We'll discuss that." Henry looked between us with the desperate recalibration of a man whose model of the situation has catastrophically failed to match reality. He opened his mouth. "Don't," Richard said quietly. Henry closed it. The figures from the shadows moved forward, and Henry Grantham, for the first time in the years I had known him, had absolutely nothing left to say. In the days that followed the docks, the city got very quiet. Not literally. The city was never literally quiet, its noise being one of its few genuinely democratic qualities. But in the specific frequency that Richard's world occupied, in the channels of communication that ran beneath the ordinary business of the metropolis like a second nervous system, something changed. I couldn't hear it directly. I experienced it the way you experience a shift in barometric pressure, not through observation but through the behavior of everything around you. Reeves smiled at breakfast on Wednesday. Not broadly. Reeves didn't do anything broadly, but the particular compression at the corners of his mouth that I had come to read as satisfaction made a brief appearance over the coffee service. Clara hummed something in the corridor outside my room on Thursday morning. Two members of the security detail who had maintained the same expression for the entirety of my residence, professional, neutral, revealing nothing, nodded at me in the entrance hall on Friday with something warmer than protocol. Richard himself said very little. This was not unusual. What was unusual was the quality of his silence, lighter somehow than it had been. The difference between a man carrying weight and a man who has set something down. On Saturday he came to find me in the study. He sat across from my drafting table and watched me work for a moment without speaking, which I had become accustomed to in the way you become accustomed to the habits of someone whose company you have stopped performing for. "Henry's associates," he said finally, "have relocated, individually, to separate cities, under circumstances that make returning inadvisable." I looked up from my tablet. "And Henry?" "Henry is currently assisting a federal investigation into the conduct of 3 municipal judges whose decisions, over the past several years, have significantly benefited people who paid for the privilege." He paused. "He has a great deal of information about those arrangements. The federal prosecutors find him very useful. He will be, for the foreseeable future, entirely occupied with that usefulness." I set down my stylus. "You handed him to them." "I provided certain documentation to certain individuals who were already looking." A precise distinction, delivered without particular emphasis. The documentation was comprehensive. Henry had, over the years, kept very detailed records of his transactions. He believed they were secure. They weren't. "Nothing is entirely secure," Richard said. "From the right perspective." I thought about the laminated photograph on the gate, the 7 words in the aggressive forward-leaning handwriting, the certainty of a man who had operated for years in the comfortable assumption that consequence was something that happened to other people, in other tax brackets with fewer connections. "He'll know it was you," I said. "Yes." Richard's expression held the particular stillness of a man entirely comfortable with being known. "He will also know that what I provided to the prosecutors represents a fraction of what I have access to. The rest remains available, should his memory of what makes returning inadvisable become unclear." The study was quiet around us. Outside the window, the grounds were moving through the particular gold of late afternoon, the light that made the estate look less like a fortress and more like a home, which I had come to understand were not mutually exclusive categories. Is it finished? I asked. Richard considered the question with genuine care, the way he considered everything. For him, he said. Yes. I turned back to my drafting tablet. My logo project, the one with the classical column motifs, was nearly complete. The Corinthian capitals had resolved themselves 2 days ago into something I was actually proud of, which was the specific satisfaction of work that required your full attention and therefore provided, while you were doing it, a complete vacation from everything else. Richard, I said without looking up. Yes. The conversation we need to have. About what comes next. I kept my stylus moving. I think we should have it soon. The silence that followed was not empty. It had the quality of a held breath. Not anxious but present. The silence of someone who has been waiting patiently and without pressure for a door to open and has just heard the handle turn. Whenever you're ready, he said. I looked up then. He was watching me with the expression he had stopped concealing since the night in the library with Claire's photograph between us on the table. Unguarded. Certain. The face of a man who has already made his decision and is simply unhurriedly waiting on mine. Tomorrow, I said. Breakfast. The corner of his mouth moved. Just barely. But I had learned to read small things. I'll tell Clara, he said. Breakfast was already set when I came downstairs. Not the usual efficient simplicity of the morning table. Coffee, fruit, whatever Clara determined was seasonally appropriate. This was different. Deliberate. The good china, which I had seen in the cabinet but never on the table. A small arrangement of flowers, white, in a low vase that didn't obstruct sight lines across the table. 2 chairs positioned not at opposite ends but adjacent, at the table's corner, the way people sit when they intend to look at the same things rather than at each other across a distance. Richard was already seated. In front of him, beside the coffee, was a manila envelope. Plain, unsealed, sitting with the particular weight of something that had been prepared carefully and set down with equal care. I sat. I poured my coffee. I looked at the envelope. You should open it, he said. Inside were documents. Several pages professionally prepared, with the clean precision of someone who had access to very good resources and had deployed them without corners cut. A name I didn't immediately recognize. A complete identity, social security, driver's license, credit history going back 4 years, a design portfolio under the new name that, I realized as I turned the pages, contained my actual work. My projects, my aesthetic, my professional history, attributed to someone who did not yet exist but could begin existing at any moment I chose. At the back, a property deed. A studio apartment in a city I had mentioned once in passing 3 weeks ago, noting that it had a design scene I'd always wanted to be part of. I had not thought he was listening with that degree of attention. I set the documents on the table. This is an exit, I said. It's an option, he said. There's a difference. I looked at him. He was watching me with the steady, unhurried attention I had come to understand was simply how Richard Benson existed in the world. Fully present, never pushing, leaving every door to my choosing. And if I stay? I said. Then you stay. He lifted his coffee. The documents remain available. Options don't expire. I thought about the woman who had driven to the harbor alone at midnight because she couldn't bear to be rescued one more time. I thought about the woman who had stood in the center of this estate's beautiful guest suite on the first day, and performed her breathing exercise and catalogued the exits. I thought about the woman on the marble floor of the Meridian Mall atrium, palm flat against the cold stone, looking up at a man removing his rings with the unhurried certainty of someone who had already decided. I thought about Claire in a yellow jacket mid-laugh, not knowing what was coming. I thought about the 11 years and 3 months and some days that Richard had been carrying the weight of a door he hadn't opened in time. And I reached for the coffee pot. I refilled my cup. I refilled his without being asked, which was the smallest possible domesticity and felt, for that reason, enormous. I have 3 client projects overdue, I said. I know. You've been stress organizing your tablet folders instead of opening the files. I looked at him. You can see my tablet from across the study? I notice things, he said simply. The estate settled around us into its morning. Somewhere in a federal building, Henry Grantham was making himself useful to prosecutors who had no interest in his comfort. Somewhere in the city, the frequency that ran beneath everything was quiet in the specific way that meant it was running smoothly rather than holding its breath. I was not looking over my shoulder. I was not calculating exits. I was sitting in a patch of early light in a house that had become, without my quite deciding it, the first place in 4 years that felt less like a location and more like a direction. A place I was moving toward rather than hiding in. "Richard," I said. He looked at me. "Thank you. Not for the clinic or the estate or the documents or the clean sweep or the 23 sessions on the basement mat. For all of it, which was too large to itemize. For seeing something worth protecting when I had largely forgotten it was there." He held my gaze for a long moment with the expression he had stopped concealing since the library. Then he looked out at the grounds, and the corner of his mouth moved in the way I had learned to read as the truest version of what he felt when words were insufficient. "Eat your breakfast," he said. I smiled into my coffee. For the first time in a very long time, I did not feel like someone waiting for the next thing to go wrong. I felt simply and completely and without qualification safe.